Alright everybody, how you doing? Today is going to be my What I Read in February video. I meant to film this last week, didn't get around to it because I'm really good at my job. So today I'm going to be going through all the books that I read in February. I think I read 8 in total. I finished one, as I record this is the 1st of March, and I finished a book today, so I feel cheeky talking about it. It feels dishonest and I feel like a massive liar. However, I'm going to talk about it because I want to bring it up in context of the fact that I'm going to be reading a much larger book by this very writer. For now, let's start with the first book I read in January. January? Jesus. What was the first book I read in February? Good question. Here it is. It was James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. This was beautiful. James Joyce, for anyone who doesn't know, is a very influential sort of writer. James Joyce is a very influential writer who wrote works such as Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. Portrait of the Artist was one of his earlier works. It was his second novel. Portrait of the Artist is Joyce essentially documenting and fictionalising his time as a child and his experiences in school with his family and his first sort of learning of writing and how the elements of the past are sort of reflected in the future. And the way that Joyce writes is just beautiful. His language is so varied and so diverse. The language itself was part of the fun. And what I mean by that, the story itself, there are elements that are very humorous and very funny. Joyce has clearly a great sense of humour. However, the language and the excitement of being able to read words that just sing to you, there's a very musical quality to Joyce's work, and he was himself a musical man. He played the lute, I think. There's a very great flow and rhythm to his writing. From that, I've since bought Ulysses and Dubliners, and I'm really excited to also try Finnegan's Wake, which I've heard is one of the most infuriatingly difficult books ever. The next book I read was The Lantern of Lost Memories. Now, I don't have my copy of this anymore because I've since taken it to charity because I didn't like the book at all. A couple of works of Japanese literature that I've read, being Before the Coffee Gets Cold and The Lantern of Lost Memories, they have fantastically novel concepts that get ruined because these are anthologies. The novel nature of the concept is ruined because you've heard it over 2, 3, 4 times even, and the same language is being used to describe how this makes you feel. In Before the Coffee Gets Cold, when characters went back into the past, the ritual of that was always described in the same way, and it became infuriating to read because you'd read it before, so there was no surprise, there was no interest, there was no excitement, because I've seen it, so what am I getting excited about? It's just a new character doing it. Lantern of Lost Memories is similarly an anthology in structure, and it follows this character, who I can't remember the name of because I lost any interest, who is a projectionist in purgatory, essentially. People who have died come to this place of purgatory. They there have to assemble a lantern of memories, which is a photo from each year of their life. In concept, it's very interesting. The characters then see a photo that has a sort of disfiguration, and they talk about that memory, and then the characters go back into the past or go back into the real world to witness that memory play out. And then that's the structure of the first one. And from the first story, I was intrigued. I thought this was a good concept, it's interesting. Then, the second story started the same way. Things started happening again in the same fashion, and I was like, ugh. The last story is really effective. It's just completely diluted by the fact that it's repetitious. The next book that I read, this is the Penelopiad, or the Penelopiad. It's based on the Odyssey by Homer, and instead of focusing on Odysseus' perspective, it focuses on Penelope's. How she has been affected and impacted by Homer being away constantly, and what she did in that time. Margaret Atwood, great prose writer. From this, very enjoyable. I was shocked at how contemporary it was. It felt really modern and very accessible, which I wasn't expecting. For anyone who has an interest in mythology, it's a really good book for that. I will say I enjoyed a lot of the sort of absurdist, modernist elements, and that concept is really great, and I really liked how Atwood used humour, because she does give her characters a real voice. Her female characters have agency. Whether I would say it was a fantastic novel or a great novel, I don't know. I'd say it was good fun. Next, I had a big surprise because I read an author whose work I don't like, and I turned out to actually really like it. So this is building up to its suspense. This is The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. For anyone who doesn't know, Faulkner's work strongly inspired, and I say strongly inspired, it basically built McCarthy's career, that being Cormac McCarthy. I am a big fan of Cormac McCarthy. In his earlier works, McCarthy's taking the elements of Faulkner that I didn't like, which was the sort of dense nature writing that sort of focused more on the atmosphere than the narrative. In As I Lay Dying, it's really hard to focus on the actions and the characters in a Faulkner novel, because he is writing beautifully, but in such a way that obfuscates from his meaning. With The Sound and the Fury, I wanted to read it because I did want to give him another chance. The reason why I like this one much more than I did with As I Lay Dying is because one of my frustrations with As I Lay Dying was that there were lots of different perspectives that all sounded the same. In The Sound and the Fury, you have characters that do not sound at all like how they sounded in As I Lay Dying. It was really great to read it and be surprised by it. And in the same way as when you get to other characters' perspectives, their writing styles are not only different from each other, but they're beautiful. Faulkner's prose is stunning. In all, I really, really enjoyed it, and I'm going to be trying more Faulkner over time. I've picked up a lot of his novels since then, and I'm just really excited to get into more of his stuff. So what was next? Good question, I don't know. The next book I read was A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole. This was another one that I'd heard about, and whether or not I'd like it or not, I didn't really know. Essentially, Confederacy of Dunces follows an intellectually gifted slob named Ignatius G. Riley, which is a fantastic name. It's a marvellous name to give a character. I just think it speaks so beautifully to his manner. And the plot essentially follows him as he is let loose upon the world and the horror that befalls him when he realises that he must enter the world of work.
I'm literally about to quit. I don't know if I'm going to do it, but I really want to.
Because this man, Ignatius, is lazy and does not want to work because he's a writer, or at least he sees himself as one. He sees himself as an intellectually superior person. He writes these great diatribes and sort of documents his life in this sort of very autobiographical way. Ignatius's hijinks and adventures in the world and just this plot that he gets himself wrapped up in. It's really funny and very entertaining. However, it's very frustrating because the character of Ignatius is so long-winded in his speech that it becomes exhausting to read them. And this is not the fault of the author. I think this is more a personal thing. It's just very difficult to sit through that and to enjoy all of it because it's very, very dense. What did I read next? I read The Ghostwriter by Philip Roth. It was refreshing and it was nice to be back in his style, his sort of very easy to read but very intellectually stimulating prose, these sort of monologues that go on and take you on all these different tangents, moving between the past and the present, very seamlessly as well. And The Ghostwriter is one of his most acclaimed works, and reading it I can see why. It didn't completely win me over, though I think that I sort of grasped onto what it was getting at a bit too late. It follows a writer named Nathan Zuckerman, who visits another writer, E.I. Lonoff, I think was his full name, and he visits him. Whilst there, he sees a woman, and this woman fascinates him because of her beauty, because of her presence. At night, when he's at their house, he overhears a conversation between Lonoff and this young woman, and this prompts him to go on this sort of odyssey of exploring his mind as to who this woman is. And what I will say is that the direction it goes is really fascinating. Conceptually, I think that's where Philip Roth really shines, is that his novels always unfold in a really strange and interesting way that when you get to the soup of it, you understand why he's written this, and it provides a purpose for everything. With a Roth book, I always like how they end. I really like the ending of Nemesis. I loved the ending of Everyman. And with this, I think it did another great ending. To me, it just didn't completely win me over. Maybe I'm just sort of out of Roth's style, and that's why I'm not as in love with this. The next book I read was White Noise by Don DeLillo. Recently, I got my girlfriend a Kindle for Valentine's Day because I'm just the best man ever. I'm planning on getting one down the line, but for now I'm using her old one. I'd found White Noise on Kindle Unlimited, and I thought I'd give it a go because I've been curious to read Don DeLillo's work. And I started it, and I was just sucked in. It's a really compelling narrative, and essentially follows this family who are surrounded by a world that is falling to pieces, but no one acknowledges it, or at least no one talks about it with the fear that they should have. Then the world is struck by, or at least their area, is struck by an airborne toxic event. This book is amazing. Up until the airborne toxic event and that whole sequence, which is really long, it's extraordinary. And then the second half, to me, I felt didn't quite keep me in the same way. It's still great, but I was just sort of a bit like, how could anything live up to that 70-minute chapter? The way the story unfolds, it's a very sort of slow, gradual unfurling of dread. Again, it's the slow realization that something's wrong and the unwillingness to acknowledge that something's wrong until it's already happening. It's a very satirical book focused on the critiques of capitalism and consumer culture, as well as academia. I think it does critique that as well. I just thought it was great. I really, really enjoyed it. Don DeLillo's prose was beautiful. The final book that I read in February / the 1st of March is The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon. Pynchon is a very infamous writer because of his dense and complex prose, his challenging narratives, his characters that have silly names, which they do, and his book Gravity's Rainbow, which is the big book that I'm planning on reading in the future. But for now, I read The Crying of Lot 49 because I looked into which books of his were the best ones to start with, and this one came up quite often. It seems it's very short and very accessible in terms of its writing, and it's a very sort of quick, breezy narrative. And it follows this character called Oedipa Maas. Now, I mean, come on. That's just a brilliant name. Oedipa Maas, Metzger, and characters such as Dr. Hilarion and, what's his name, Mikey Fallopian. It's just such a fun, non-serious world. You're sort of trapped in this paranoid conspiracy, or the character is trapped in this conspiracy, and you're just falling headfirst down with them. Paranoia is so obvious in this book that there's literally a band in it that feature called The Paranoids. Pynchon is not trying to hide his motives. I don't care about that. I think he does a great job in portraying them. His prose is fast-moving, it's dynamic, it's exciting, and his sentences are sort of labyrinthine in their structure. There's so many commas that just break up everything, but it sort of elongates and also sort of segregates meaning. However, they move with such a beauty to them, and there's such a great rhythm that it becomes just a joy to read. In the same way as a lot of the postmodern writers like DeLillo, his humour is great. He's so funny, very full of irony, absurdism, definitely. It's a very blackly comic book, and I really like that about it, and I'm excited to read more of his stuff because it's just great. Now, the big one, the big book, the really big book, the massive gargantuan book. This is my Infinite Jest update. If you've seen one of my more recent videos, you'll know that I started reading Infinite Jest. This is a big thing for me because I don't read long books very often, or at least I hadn't previously. And I'm doing that this year, is moving on to long books. So I thought, why not start with the biggest one that I can think of, which is Infinite Jest. I had no interest in reading this book up until I found out about Wallace as a person. I'd heard of Infinite Jest, I think everyone's heard of it. I'd heard of Foster Wallace. I thought of him as this kind of weird hippy-dippy guy.
Well, you know, that's just like your opinion, man.
I found myself to be gladly wrong when I started watching interviews with him, and just his personality and his considered nature and his sort of gentleness in the way he spoke. Granted, he wasn't a very gentle person, but that's beside the point. His manner and his temperament in the way he spoke and how considered his answers were was really interesting to me. And the things he was saying were so prescient and really timely. His interviews were just really interesting, and I thought that sort of grew my interest in the book itself. The core concept of the book, which is the Infinite Jest tape, which is a tape that when you watch it, you become entranced by because it's so entertaining, and you can't move, you can't do anything, you're just stuck there watching it. It's a concept that really accurately depicts what Wallace is going for with his characters, which is addiction. That's the key of this book. And I think what he's trying to do is put it in a term that everyone, regardless of who they are, because not everyone has a drug addiction, do they? Not everyone is addicted to drugs, not everyone is addicted to alcohol. Everyone is addicted to media. We live in a media-saturated world. We live in a world where there are screens that follow us everywhere. They are pervasive. You cannot escape them. In the same way as I'm talking to you now through a screen, you are watching me through a screen. And this is a really simple way of putting that to people who don't have that experience with addiction. I'm 600 pages through. It's exceptional. The characters are so rounded and funny. It's so sad. It's so great at generating empathy. The stories of drug addicts in this book, the stories putting them in such human, honest and authentic terms and making it really, really vulnerable and very uncomfortable to sit through. It completely changed my perspective on it, and I'm just so in awe of how Wallace has done this. There's not a section that I've been outwardly bored in, which is staggering considering how much of it I've read. That's my Infinite Jest update, really. I'm planning on finishing it in March. I think I will. I am so happy with how I've done so far. I'm just excited to read more long books, to give myself more time with books. That's all I've read in February. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video.